Since 1938, Superman has been a massive part of pop culture, and we all know his story. Or do we? I'm Walter Benasiak, and this is Top 5. Over the Man of Steel's nearly 80-year history, he's changed a lot. Many of his powers have grown and diminished throughout the decades, but there are many concrete things we know about Superman that make up the character we all recognize. Given the name Kal-El at birth, he's the son of Jor-El and Laura. He's from the planet Krypton, which explodes as he's jettisoned off his homeworld, supposedly being its last survivor. He lands in Smallville, Kansas, and is raised by Jonathan and Martha Kent. He develops powers due to
his dense molecular structure
and is powered by the Earth's yellow sun. He works at the Daily Planet newspaper as Clark Kent while protecting Metropolis and the world as Superman. He's typically the moral standard in any situation and is pretty humble considering he has all the powers of a god. He also has a thing for Lois Lane. Plenty of stories over the years have messed around with those tentpoles, changing an aspect of his origin here, tweaking his personality there. Lots of these little alterations change the character in interesting ways and create fresh tales for him to be challenged by. Some of those variations on Superman make up some of my personal favorite comics and animated movies and episodes. So I thought I'd share them with you today. These are the top 5 best alternate versions of Superman. Number 5. Soviet Superman from Superman Red Son. Instead of crashing in Kansas, Superman's rocket ship plummets down to Earth in the middle of a Ukrainian collective farm. In the 1950s, Superman makes his public debut as a pawn of the Soviet government. Gone are the values of truth, justice, and the American way, as they are replaced with Superman being the champion of the common worker who fights a never-ending battle for Stalin, socialism, and the international expansion of the Warsaw Pact. The premise of Superman being raised in Soviet Russia may just sound like a decent gimmick to give us a unique story, but Red Son is so much more than that. This book isn't a simple good guys, bad guys deal. It would have been easy to make it that way and just have Superman be the evil communist, but writer Mark Millar goes for something much more nuanced. This version of Superman has a lot of inner conflict. He truly believes what he's doing is the right thing. However, the circumstances surrounding his reluctant ascent to power see him compromise in ways that become more and more terrifying the longer he remains in that position. This is a long-term story over a period of many years, so in it we see Superman change as the weight of running most of the world starts to affect his once more optimistic and innocent approach to peace. Lex Luthor in this story is the perfect foil for Superman. Their rivalry now extends from just Metropolis to the US versus Russia. Lex makes Superman an even more interesting character in this book. Also, we get some amazing sequences that involve Red Son's versions of Batman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern. There are a lot of unexpected twists and turns across all 3 parts of this story, and it might be the best one told on this list. Its depiction of Superman alone is worth checking it out. Number 4. Kal-El, the Green Lantern of Space Sector 1003 in Superman, Last Son of Earth. Jonathan Kent is a scientist who sends his infant son Clark into space as a way of saving him from a meteor that is about to level the planet. Instead of staying in orbit and returning to Earth after the most severe damage has run its course, a wormhole appears and transports the rocket ship to Krypton. Jor-El and Laura discover the ship, and the former decides to raise the encased baby as his own son and heir. He is slowly eased into the rougher atmosphere of Krypton and grows to adulthood there. When the adopted Kal-El discovers the ruins of a crashed Green Lantern vessel, he becomes the Lantern assigned to Krypton's space sector. However, Kal has many questions that have plagued his mind since he was young, the main one being, where did he come from? The idea of Superman as a Green Lantern is another cool premise. Who wouldn't want to see that? But the aspect to this story that intrigued me the most is the fact that Superman is sent from Earth to Krypton. Writer Steve Gerber takes his time in telling the backstory of all the players and settings involved before going off and following Kal-El's journey. He's definitely an outcast as an Earthling on Krypton, and in a very different way from the reversal that we're used to. He's effectively relatable. This just feels refreshing and works surprisingly well. After becoming a Green Lantern, Kal-El starts to really push his adoptive father on the issue of his true origins. This all leads to a return to Earth, where the originally named Clark Kent searches for answers. I won't spoil the rest of the story, as I think it should get more attention, but this version of Superman comes across very different while holding the character's true essence at his core. There was a sequel made a few years later called Last Stand on Krypton, but I don't think it's all that great. Just stick to Last Son on Earth for a fun and engaging alternate Superman experience. Number 3. SuperboyPrime. Now, this one is a bit confusing. I'll try to make it simple. This version of Clark Kent hails from Earth Prime, a world meant to be similar to our own where superheroes, including Superman, only exist in comic books. Many things about this character's background are identical or very close to the mainstream version. He was transported from Krypton to Earth and raised there by a couple with the last name Kent. While in his teens, he had yet to develop his powers when we first meet him in DC's legendary event, Crisis on Infinite Earths. In this storyline, his powers manifest while the multiverse, including his Earth, is being destroyed. Years after that event, in 2006's Infinite Crisis, he returns as a crazed villain hell-bent on recreating his Earth and destroying anyone in his way. His fractured mind, in addition to his Superman powers, make him one of the most powerful villains in the DCU. There's a lot more to his story, but the main idea here is that this is a young, confused Superman whose Earth was destroyed and he has completely lost his mind. SuperboyPrime is a great villain because we can almost sympathize with him. He was pulled from an Earth that was wiped from existence while years of isolation and prodding basically turned him into a psychopath. He is a big villain in the main DCU, which means he's in a lot of stories all the way up to very recently. So I'll just give you a few reading suggestions if you want some examples of what he's all about. You could start at Infinite Crisis, where they explain the very complicated events that happened in Crisis on Infinite Earths while reintroducing him as a villain. Also, take a look at Sinestro Corps War. In addition to being a fantastic Green Lantern arc, SuperboyPrime is a big baddie in that one and has a few great fights. Number 2. Superman, Son of Zod, in Justice League, Gods, and Monsters. Just as Jor-El is about to enter his DNA into a birthing matrix that is to be sent off a dying Krypton, General Zod busts in and instead adds his DNA to the sequence. This mixes with Laura's as the spaceship containing the now developing fetus travels to Earth. Years later, a much different backstory has now occurred. Still taking the name Superman, the Son of Zod is in the Justice League with alternate versions of Batman and Wonder Woman. They are much more ruthless than we're used to, and while Superman does use his powers for good, he's a very different character that constantly has an inner struggle about doing the right thing versus his own dominating desires. Without the House of El being a part of him, this Superman is definitely not the character we all know. The drastic change in his parentage creates a much more morally ambiguous Man of Steel. In addition to his Kryptonian heritage being changed, his coming of age on Earth is also massively different. While I suggest you all check out Justice League, Gods, and Monsters if you haven't, you can really get the gist of who this Superman is in a great short that came out just before the film called Bomb. In it, Superman is tasked with taking down Brainiac, but this version of Brainiac isn't just an emotionless machine.
When I was a child, I had to learn how to control my powers. You have to control yours. Concentrate.
I can't stop it. I can't.
I can.
It's beautifully tragic, and I'd love to see more about this version of Superman. Maybe one day we'll get more. And the #1 best alternate version of Superman is Clark Kent in Superman: Secret Identity. Inspired by the original appearances of SuperboyPrime, the Clark Kent in Secret Identity does bear some similarities to that version of the character, but he's taken in a completely different direction. Clark Kent is a regular American boy who was named after Superman's alter ego as a joke by his family, a family who also just so happens to live in a small town in Kansas. As with SuperboyPrime, Superman and superheroes only exist in the pages of comic books. Clark constantly has to deal with the obvious comparisons to the fictional Superman and is often picked on for it. One night, out of seemingly nowhere, Clark develops superpowers very close to that of the Man of Steel. However, this is still very much a realistic world, so no supervillain step forth to oppose him, and Clark decides to keep his power secret while doing good as often as possible. We follow him through his life as a writer and author, while he privately becomes the hero he was once mocked for sharing a name with. In my opinion, this is the most complete character of any of the ones mentioned here, and he exists in probably my favorite Superman comic. It's just an amazing, simple story, but it works perfectly for what they went for. A character study throughout, we see Clark from high school to old age as everything is presented from his perspective. As stated before, this isn't exactly Superman since he's only a comic book character in this world. This Clark is not from Krypton. There's nothing really abnormal about him until he mysteriously develops his powers. Writer Kurt Busiek really knocked it out of the park with this thoughtful and authentic feeling life, really. It's a portrait of someone's life in 4 wonderful parts. Clark has real concerns and is living in a way we can all relate to, with the added benefits and stress of having Superman-like powers. I love this characterization and story he lives in. It's a great book, so look for Superman's Secret Identity if you want the ultimate alternate Superman. I'd suggest to you to check out all the comics and animated projects I've presented here for fun and different takes on a character many of us have loved our whole lives. For more content, subscribe to my personal channel, youtube.com/awesomewalter, like my new Facebook page, facebook.com/awesomewalterb, and follow me on Twitter to take part in more polls about what may be covered in the future. Come back next week for a brand new episode of Top 5.